That's true, yeah. Which is a community content Brownian notion.
Yes.
No, I just did. Well, I think it's like we just well, no,
Right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for turning out on this chilly December day. It's good to see such a good turnout as well. I think we've still got a few more to come too. Just a couple of notices, the usual thing to kick us off, health and safety stuff and so on. You've probably all found the toilets by now. The ladies is just out the door and down the stairs to the left. The gents is behind the reception desk. There isn't a fire alarm due today or planned today, so if we do hear anything, we're going to have to scarper. And you do that by heading for this curtain in the corner, apparently. So that will be thrust aside, unless you can go out. Those at the back might prefer to go out the back way and out the main door. Either way, we will assemble in the large quadrangle outside the Royal Academy. That's the meeting place in the event of a fire. And if the discussion becomes too rarefied, then oxygen masks will descend from the ceiling during the meeting. Okay, I suppose the germ of the idea for this meeting started maybe a couple of years ago. Having been very much a public sector boy for 30-odd years, Met Office and BBC, and you don't get much more public sector than that. Retiring from that, I dipped my toe in the private sector a couple of years ago when I finished. Working with a very small organisation looking to improve weather services in parts of West Africa, in commodity crops, things like coffee, cocoa, and also cashew. Can we just move on to that next slide, please? Thank you. I'll move on to the next slide. See, I'm out of practice with this clicker business after years out of the weather presenting. Should be there. Anyway, it's not important. Dipping my toe in the private sector was an interesting experience. As we know, weather observations across Africa are not plentiful. There are some pretty big gaps in there. So to get round some of that, we actually had to install some of our own weather stations. And we installed Davis Agro-Met stations, decent bits of kit, fully automatic, sending the observations back via the mobile phone network, which was great, did the job as far as we were concerned. And I thought, well, you know, it'd be great, wouldn't it, if some of this data that we're actually producing, because we didn't need to hang on to it, we were quite happy to share it, could actually make its way into the public domain. You know, why not try and get some of this stuff feeding into the weather models to actually improve things in the areas where it's data sparse? But I very soon realised when I looked into trying to do that, that there just isn't really any sort of mechanism. Unless you're full WMO spec, unless you're really part of the national Met services, there is no mechanism at the moment, really, of getting that sort of information into the national network, the global network, which is feeding the current weather models. So as I looked into it more, I realised that there were growing numbers of these sort of observations. There are growing private sector observation networks, and not just on the surface either. We now have private companies actually running satellites which are producing weather measurements. It's a real time of rapid change. Add on top of that, that we now have capability within the private sector to actually do the weather modelling, and IBM are the current leaders in that. And essentially you have a whole private sector setup alongside what has up till now been the preserve of governments, capable of actually running a whole global weather enterprise. So it struck me that really, you know, this is something we need to talk about, certainly as a society, as a meteorological community. It is being talked about within the community. The WLMO, in June of this year, at their Congress, came out with what they called the Geneva Declaration, which recognises the need for public, private sector and academic sector to really start having serious conversations about how we actually work together to move these things forward. Because the benefits, the potential benefits from doing that are enormous. It makes no sense for us to actually be doing these things in competition. So that's the conversation that we're hoping to have here today. That's what we'll be hearing from the speakers about what is happening so far in that conversation, what we hope will happen in that conversation in the future as well. So first up, we've got somebody who has definitely spent most of his time in the public sector, Professor Alan Thorpe. He's held senior positions at the Met Office, University of Reading, where he's a visiting professor currently. He's director of the Natural Environment Research Council and the National Centre for Atmospheric Science, and most recently, director of ECMWF from 2011 to 2015. He's also just been appointed as non-exec director on the Met Office board and has a part-time position with the World Bank. He's also involved in the private sector as a scientific advisor to Spire Global, which is one of the new companies which is actually running a fleet of weather satellites up there as well. So, Alan, can I hand over to you? And I'll just point out that's what you need to use. So you've got forward and back. You need to point at the window up there, because that's where the receiver is.
Okay.
Whatever you do, don't press the big black button.
Right.
The white one is
Too tempting. Thank you very much, Peter. So my talk is about the evolution of the global weather enterprise, as you can tell. Perhaps I should explain why the logos on the slide are the World Bank. The presentation really arises from work that I've been doing with the World Bank, and in particular the group in the World Bank, which is called the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. And so that's why they are there. So I wanted to, first of all, start by perhaps a bit pedantically, but to say what this term global weather enterprise means. Because I've had various people over recent years come up to me and say, well, what's this new business? What's this new company that's called the Global Weather Enterprise? It's not a company. It's just a name that's being used in a lot of countries to represent really all of the activities that public, private and academic sectors get involved with to provide accurate and reliable and timely weather and climate information. And so what I'm going to be talking about, and probably other speakers as well, is about the provision of weather information. I'm not really going to refer too much today about the use of weather information. I'm going to be talking about how the public, private and academic sectors come together to create this information in the first place. And it's often referred to as a value chain, and on the next slide I'll say why I think that's the case. And I think it's important to have this background before we talk about the relationship between the three sectors. And from the World Bank's point of view, and perhaps all of our points of view, why do we do any of this? It's because, as we know, that this is vital information for the safety of life and property, poverty reduction, and the promotion of economic development. And that's very much reflected in nearly all of the Sustainable Development Goals and also in Agenda 2030. So this value chain, there's many versions of this diagram. This is just my version. And it tries to, in a sense, step through the different compartments that make up ultimately the kind of weather and climate information that people use. Starting in the top left with the observations that we take. Then those observations are utilised within a numerical model of some sort, which needs a computer, top right, which is a major part of the chain. So the equations that are numerically solved in that computer produces analyses and predictions that the scientists would recognise as numbers that are predictions. They're not particularly useful in terms of the use of that information until they're turned into weather forecasts, meteorological forecasts. Even there, most of the users are not really that interested in the weather forecasts themselves, but rather the derived information that uses weather information to help them live their lives and their businesses, etc. And of course, also that use of the weather information is alongside lots of other data streams that come together to help businesses and individuals live their lives. So the last box on the bottom left is very much other data sources coming in as well. And I've got the arrows going round that way to give a sense of a value chain. You know, the observations, we start with those, and we add value all the way around until we have the usable weather information. And I think, let's move on to the point I want to make is that one of the reasons for showing this is because I want to refer back to where the public, private and academic sectors are active in these different boxes as we go around. And I think that's one of the ways of looking at the evolution of the global weather enterprise. One thing I wanted to say, though, before doing that is you might wonder in those boxes where on earth did science and technology go to, because there's not a box that says science. And that's because, actually, if you try and draw this diagram, science and technology is in every box. So actually, you know, I've splattered it across the centre of this diagram because whether it's in the observations, in the numerical modelling, in the computing, in the analyses, in the forecasts, science and technology is embedded throughout. And I think one of the things that this tells us, and knowing as we do in this room about the science and technology, that the global weather enterprise is an incredibly dynamic business. It's not static. All the time, the weather information is changing and improving because science and technology is changing and improving. And in many respects, but not all respects, the pipeline between research and operations, if you like, R2O, is incredibly effective in meteorology. That's not to say it's perfect, but nonetheless, I think it's something that we can be very proud of. I'm going to talk quite a bit about ultimately the use of weather information, not the users, but how it's used. So in a sense, there's a flavour of an operational feel to this talk. But even if you're just working in new techniques for observing the atmosphere or new modelling techniques, and that's all you think about, that's fine. But actually that information gets moved around this value chain and ultimately is used for operational purposes. So that's my excuse for that. So who does what in those boxes? This would take several lectures in itself, so I'm not going to bore you with that. But there are key sectoral organisations in this, of course, as we all know. In the public sector, there are, very strongly the National Meteorological and Hydrological Services. The private sector companies, obviously, and the academic sector, universities and research establishments. So what do they do? And one of the questions is, do some of these key organisations, do they focus on just parts of the value chain, parts of these components? And this is sort of a key underlying question to today's meeting. There is a strong evolution in the science and technology, as I've said, but there's also a strong evolution in the capability of these various organisations to contribute to the global weather enterprise. And that's, I'll elaborate more on that in a moment. We're going to focus today a lot on the private sector, but that's not because somehow I'm biased towards the private sector. It's just that it's one of the areas that is central to this meeting in particular. But of course, the evolution and development of capabilities in the public and academic sector is large as well. An important point that we need to factor in is that there's huge disparities in the regulatory environment in different countries for this enterprise. And, one of the difficulties is to have a picture of how this business works, because in different countries it works in radically different ways. And that's not least because the government framework for how national meteorological services operate, how the private sector can operate, radically differs between countries. And this is one of the big challenges for a global weather enterprise, where actually we rely not just on our own resources within country, but across the world on other people's resources as well. So as a consequence of this slide on who does what, at the bottom is the most important bit, and that is that the roles of these organisations and the extent to which they compete with each other or collaborate with each other continue to be really hot topics. And it's one of the areas where, in terms of competition and collaboration, if it's unclear how the regulatory environment is set, it's unclear what these organisations are doing, then bad things can happen, like either unfair or inappropriate competition, etc. So it's a really important aspect, the roles and responsibilities, which I'm sure we'll come back to, including in the discussion. So there are lots of changes taking place in the global weather enterprise at the moment, and I wrote a paper with David Rogers last year in the Bulletin of the American MetSoc, where we tried to list some of the key changes that are happening at the moment in the weather enterprise. And these are the list in that paper. I'm sure you can add to them. And I'm going to very, very briefly run through these. Obviously, one of the things at the moment is that the societal need for weather information is growing really fast. And, climate change obviously is one of the drivers for that. But the way there are more people living in more vulnerable situations means that weather information and the requirements of society for weather information is growing fast. What that translates into for our community is we're being asked to do a lot more than we used to be asked to do, both in weather and climate. Fortunately, there's lots of science and technology innovation, which, as I've already said, means that our business as an enterprise is very dynamic and developing all the time. The third point is that there's an increasing appetite for and benefits from many more observations. And on the next slide, the two blue bullets I'm going to amplify a little bit more, so I'll come back to that. The fourth is that there's been now and recently a big growth in the capability of the private sector to contribute in those boxes in the value chain. And I think it's very valid to say today that actually the private sector is capable in all of those boxes of the value chain. And that was not the case going back some decades. The next point is that the National Meteorological Services are worldwide, are under great funding pressures. Inevitably, part of the public sector, when times are difficult, then this can happen. So we've got a situation where the private sector is growing and is more capable, and the National Meteorological Services are under financial pressure. The next point is that there's been a big move in general from the provision of capital-based infrastructure to service-based approach. And if I can draw an analogy with the music industry, we're all very familiar now that we don't typically buy discs or CDs, although there's a bit of a retro move in that direction, but that we've moved from owning a bit of physical kit, the CD, to streaming the music that we like as a service from a service provider. And you can see this happening within our field as well. And I'll come back to this a bit when I talk about data provision. The penultimate point on this slide is that the weather information that's out there, we have a really serious question to be addressed about how we know about its quality and the standards that it has. We need to have a better grip on the ownership principles and how that data is accessed. And there's a lot, because of the development of the private sector particularly, this is a really important topic. And finally, there are changes in international financing. For example, the World Bank that I'm working with provides development loans to modernize national meteorological services in developing countries, a huge, huge amount of money to governments in the form of development loans. And the World Bank has changed its strategy to now saying that actually that money can be spent and should be spent, if appropriate, via stimulating the private sector and not just spent on the public sector. So there are big changes there in international financing. Just to pick up on the two blue points on the observations, I like to show this picture from ECMWF, which on the left shows in 1979, which is sort of when I started my career in meteorology, how many observations there were. There were roughly 20,000 daily active reports from 14 data sources on the left, and the satellite picture, which doesn't show up too well, is what you could do in those days in terms of using the data to construct a pseudo-satellite picture from the model output. You can see the various data sources on the left. And on the right-hand side is today, where a centre like the Met Office or ECMWF are using roughly 50 million daily active reports and from 90 data sources. And you can see the growth of the satellite blob in the middle has grown hugely in terms of the number of instruments, but also different sorts of measurements. So the global observing system, this is a sort of plug for the fact that this is, if I can use this term in the UK, it doesn't work elsewhere, this is the crown jewels of our enterprise. And it's a very fragile entity because it relies on a huge amount of international cooperation and collaboration. And although it looks fantastic on the right-hand side with this 50 million observations and the pseudo-satellite picture looks a lot better now, there are still huge data gaps. And as Peter said in his introduction, it's clear that not only are there places that aren't observed well, and Africa would be a good example, but there are places where there are observations taken and they're not getting through to other centres to be able to predict the weather. So observations is fundamental. The other thing to say about this is that this is a great slide for public, private, academic sector synergy and collaboration, because these observations, have gone through a big transition. If you think about 1979, the Met Office used to design, build and operate its own radiosonde. Nowadays, that's outsourced to private companies, although one tends to dominate, for that. So the private sector, in terms of satellites, the private sector, a lot of these instruments now, high-quality instruments, are produced and even deployed by the private sector. So it's been a great synergy between the three sectors. So as I've said, the private sector is much more capable than it used to be. And in terms of observations, the private sector is active in design, manufacture, and operation of instruments. So the private sector, as Peter said, has networks of observing instruments and observations, such that the private company owns the data, also owns the instruments, of course, but runs the network. So they can provide a data service, and I'll show the example that Peter mentioned in a moment of the constellation of commercial weather satellites. Computing's the same. The computers that we use are private sector developed, manufactured and operated, and increasingly this is moving over, from our point of view, from a capital-based investment to a service-based investment. Increasingly, cloud computing services will become the norm, and other people will be operating the computers, and we will be buying computer cycles from the private sector to do that. Modelling, again, as Peter's mentioned, there are companies, and it's not just IBM, there are quite a few companies who have in-house global and regional models. Not only that, but they're running them operationally. And by operationally, I mean several times a day globally to generate numerical weather predictions. As well as that, the private sector, like IBM, again with others, are developing large data analytics and machine learning techniques, which mean that actually, in many respects, the utilization of the NWP information has much more value and impact. Just in parentheses, I should say, how do private companies operate and use global weather models? Surely they don't have the resources to write an NWP model for the globe. Of course they don't. What they do is they use public sector funded global models that are open sourced, like, for example, the US model, which a lot of companies use to do this. So it's actually, from a governmental point of view, a great example of public investment being utilised by the private sector thereby generating jobs and corporate taxes on the back of that. That's the positive spin on it. A lot of people on the public sector side think this is something bad about it, in the sense that all of this work that's done on the public sector side is somehow being utilised for profit on the private sector side. And I think that kind of thinking we have to really be critical of and to really examine carefully, because it's getting in the way of proper interaction between the different sectors. And then, as I say, from an operational point of view, these companies are very active. And rather than IBM, I'm going to choose an example that's not IBM. This is the constellation of nanosatellites. These are CubeSats, which are small satellites, nominally a metre by a metre by a metre, or smaller than that even, that this company, Spire, has got 80 satellites in a constellation at the moment, and growing all the time. They've raised venture capital, so there's no public money gone into this. They own the satellites. They've got them launched on various platforms such as SpaceX and other platforms. And the green dots on the right-hand side is a map of the globe. You probably can't see the continents underneath it. But this represents the 5,000 temperature profiles a day that the technique that they're using, which is GPS radial occultation, provides temperature profiles through the atmosphere. And the nice thing about it is, because of this constellation of many, many satellites, two things: they can have good global coverage of these data. And secondly, if one of these satellites fails, because they're relatively cheap to relaunch and to rebuild, they can be replenished very cost effectively. So this means that we're in a position where this company, and it's one of several, owns the satellites, owns the data, and the global weather enterprise, the weather forecast, would benefit hugely, the public weather forecast, from using these data. Yet we don't really have in place the business model to enable funds to flow to be able to support the company to be able to produce these data, because clearly they have to get some money to be able to run this system. Yet we're not really set up to be able to find a way to support that from the public purse, which would have to be for this to improve the public weather forecast. So it's another good example of where we don't necessarily have the sort of business model in place to enable this to succeed. Yet there's real potential here for many more observations, and this is just one of several I could mention. Lightning networks would be another one, where the private sector is capable of giving us a lot more observations if we could access them. Meteo Group was my other example about forecasting services. I'm not trying to advocate Meteo Group or Spire, by the way, but this is actually just taken from their website, and I was pretty amazed to look at this. Global, phrases like global reach, ultra-accurate forecasting, built on the world's best weather models, 120 meteorologists, 8 product suites, ultra-accurate forecasting for any location worldwide, ... up to 15 days ahead. This is a major offer from this company, and I think it's something that, in a sense, they're one of a group now that are capable in this respect. And it's something that the global weather enterprise, and particularly perhaps the public sector side, need to factor into the thinking as we go forward. How are we going to work with and have a synergistic relationship with these sorts of companies? Because, if we don't do that, one of my concerns is that somehow monopolistically, one of the big companies like Google or IBM, they're capable of perhaps growing such that it absorbs more and more of the whole enterprise. And my response to that is we should get into collaboration with them, and that will be a way to secure both the public and private sector's input. There are a lot of that's a good intro to a lot of sectoral interdependencies. No one country or organisation can operate alone, not even IBM yet, because the global observing system, they have to have the observations. Where they're going to get those from, it's funded by the public sector at the moment. But we maximise the value of research, modelling and observations if we can share this information as widely as possible. That's a really critical factor that we need. Yet we don't really yet have in place enough, anyway, of the business model that supports all these sectors. As I was saying with the constellation of small satellites, there has to be a way in which the private sector and the public sector can support each other, and that the funds enable both sectors to thrive. In this respect, public investment acts as a vital stimulus. And as I say, governments, certainly in the developed world, recognise that public investment needs to stimulate private enterprise and economic development. So what's the problem? There are many problems. I've touched on a few of them. Data access and sharing. In a world where there are data, observational data and other sorts of data that are owned by companies or other organisations, how are we going to get access to those data? How are we going to share them? How are we going to enable the public and other users to get out of harm's way and to save lives? How are we going to deal with the quality assurance question? When you buy your new mobile phone, it's an old story, but nevertheless I'll tell it, you can choose from 50 or 100 different weather apps. You have no idea where the data's come from, what the accuracy of it is, and actually they differ from one another. And there are even weather apps, of course, that are giving weather warnings, not just weather forecasts, and these differ from the official weather warning. So there's a real problem of quality assurance, and in an era of fake news discussion, etc., we have our own issue, I think, about this, which we have to be very careful about. And I worry, personally, that not enough attention is being paid to how to do this quality assurance so that the users can have some comfort that the information they're using is high quality. And there are many mechanisms we could use, like ISO standards, like kite marking, like professional bodies giving a stamp of approval. But at the moment, we're not really utilising that too much. One of the problems is competition between sectors. if we have a competition between the public sector and the private sector, that can have some very negative impacts on both sides. Competition within a sector, like the private sector, of course, within the private sector, companies compete with each other and they expect to do so. But where you have competition between public and private, or even academic sector, then things can go radically wrong, and particularly trust and collaborative effort. Roles and responsibilities I've mentioned are changing all the time because of the evolution of the global weather enterprise, and it's far from clear that anybody can stand up from any organisation and say, I have the right to do A, B and C and no one else can do it. Because now a lot of organisations are capable in all of the areas of the value chain. And in the end, our problem is to sustain the global observing system and all of the structure that enables this weather information to be produced. So one of the things that I've been involved with is to try to improve the dialogue between the public, private and academic sectors in the global weather enterprise. And surprising to me, when I started to do this work, there really wasn't a place where the three sectors, representatives of the three sectors, could, in an environment where each was valued, to have a discussion about some of these issues. And so we've established, or the World Bank in association with the hydrometeorological equipment enterprises, have created this Global Weather Enterprise Forum, which is a dialogue opportunity, and it works mostly via online tools. There's the website link for you there. The membership is open to it, and it's there to try and tackle and test out some of the new ways of improving the delivery and sustainability of weather information. At the same time, the WMO has recognised, as Peter said via the Geneva Declaration, that the WMO itself has to be much more open to the private sector. And so they've launched at the same time as the Geneva Declaration in June, something called the Open Consultative Platform, bit of a mouthful, and that's really to try to have a place where, again, the private sector, academic sector and public sector can discuss WMO processes and get contributions from all sectors. This is still very embryonic, but it's very complementary to the Global Weather Enterprise Forum, because the WMO platform largely will focus on some of the international policy questions, whereas the forum is looking to test out specific ways to do and tackle some of those problem areas I mentioned. So my final slide, take-home messages. The future is ongoing science and technology innovations. We can argue about how the science and technology is going to look in the future, but I think we can probably all agree that there are still really exciting developments on the horizon that will take us forward. And that's great because a lot more is expected of us. There's an increased demand for weather and climate forecasts. We tend to say, oh, well, ECMWF has a 9-kilometre mesh size resolution. It shouldn't be called resolution. That's the mesh size. The actual scale at which the phenomenon are well represented with a 9-kilometre mesh is something like 50 kilometres. If you look at the energy spectrum, it's not well represented for smaller scales than about 50. So we've got a huge way to go still to get weather forecasts and climate predictions down to the scale where it's interacting with people and communities. So there's tremendous demand there. If you look at the recent history, and projecting into the future, there's been a tremendous growth of the global weather enterprise. This pie here is supposed to represent the three sectors in the colours, and a conservative estimate of the growth of the global weather enterprise in the next 10 years is that it will increase by a factor of 10, which is roughly the area of that circle growing by a factor of 10. I've shown it such that the academic, private and public sectors keep the same share of the pie. That's not obvious, obviously. That could be that maybe the private sector will grow relatively stronger than the public and academic sector, or vice versa. But even so, if we're going to have that kind of growth, because of what I've said already about the increased demand, it's hugely likely that all of the sectors will benefit from this growth. So the main thing is, how do we make sure that we work most effectively together? And that's why I'm strongly trying to get involved with this increasing dialogue and improving cooperation between the sectors, rather than having inappropriate and unfair competition. And that's the end. Thank you.
Perfect timing. Thanks, Alan. We'll make a weather forecaster of you yet. Interesting, almost intuitive use of the word sides. And I think we all, public sector sides, private sector side. We can't help feeling that we're within teams, and that's what we do really need to break down here to get things really going forward. Thanks very much for that. I'm inclined to leave questions to the end, as we have a pretty generous forum discussion at the end of the whole session. So unless there's anything absolutely burning at the moment, if you could bear the questions in mind, and we'll throw those forward to the end of the session, because we have 50 minutes set aside for that. Our next contributor is going to make a virtual appearance. Unfortunately, Professor Mary Glackin, who I think you can see behind me, yeah, there we go, had some last-minute problems, which meant she wasn't able to travel here to speak to us today. But she has sent her slides, of course, and she's also recorded a presentation for us. So hopefully those two things are going to mesh together and mean that we will hear from Mary, because I think she's got some very important things to say. She's certainly someone with extensive experience at high levels, both public and private sector. She was Deputy Undersecretary at NOAA, served as the agency's Chief Operating Officer before moving on to the Weather Company, which of course is an IBM business. She was Vice President for Weather Business Solutions there and managed the company's relationships with members of the national and global weather enterprise, amongst other things. So highly experienced in the private sector too. And she's just about to move on to her next challenge as the incoming president of the American Meteorological Society. So hopefully this is all going to work. Do you want me to take... yeah, I'll take responsibility for moving the slides on. Mary's been very good at giving some good cues in her talk, so let's see how this goes. Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. I regret not being there in person, but I'm really honored to have been asked to contribute to this conversation this afternoon. And so I want to address a few things. You'll see from the title here, I have conflict or cooperation. And that really reflects that I see that we have going ahead some opportunities in front of us, but we really have a number of challenges as well. So it's really going to be how we address these kind of straight on to ensure we evolve the enterprise, and most importantly, weather and climate services for the global citizens in the best possible way. I do want to note that while I'll become president of the American Meteorological Society in January, my talk today is really based on my personal views, and that is with more than 30 years of public service experience in the last 5 years in the private sector. So on this next slide, I want to just highlight how really important weather and climate has become. It's really big business these days. So I was really impressed. I have a number of ways I'm asserting that. One of the ones is that IBM did a survey in 2018 of C-suite executives and asking about the importance of weather and climate to their bottom line. And you can see from the couple of statistics here, it was really overwhelming that they agree that it's impacting both their operating costs and their potential revenue. I think what was really interesting about it, though, is they really recognize that they need weather insights. And by this, I think they're talking about impact-based decision-making, as we've been talking about in the weather enterprise. And then the 68% of them really say that they're very interested in weather insights as a service. So they don't want the raw data. They don't want to know what the temperature is or the ceiling or visibility is. They want to know what it is in terms of what their business metrics are. So whether that's throughput at an airport or inventory supply chain, they need that bottom line to their business, and they need it on a continual basis. They don't want to address weather and climate just as periodically. They want it in their day-to-day operations. The other things in here I think this audience probably is very familiar with, and that's the U.S. Sustainable Development Goals are really based on improved weather and climate information. We won't get there without that. And then the bottom line is just a snapshot of the U.S. weather and climate disasters, billion-dollar disasters in 2018 that NOAA put out. And it's a reminder that the work that we do impacts lives every day, lives and property every day. So in this next slide, Alan talked about the supply chain, the value chain, and from observations into really the impact or the decision that's made. I just want to make the point here that we're seeing disruption across this value chain, whether it's being driven by cheaper access to space with CubeSats, to the application of AI to areas that we haven't seen before. I know of people that are applying this right within numerical weather prediction models these days. And there's a lot of innovation going on in the post-processing and the impacts. And the point that I'm making here in the bottom line on this slide is that's a good thing, because there's really much room for improvement across this value chain. It's not like we're starting with a system that is really meeting all the needs that we have. So it's a good thing that we're seeing this disruption, even though it's really uncomfortable as we move through. On this next slide, I just it was really caught my eye as I was preparing this talk, that it was on the front of the Washington Post business section on a Sunday, this headline about weather being big business, and it's supposing that we're veering towards a collision between the public and the private sector. So there is a lot of attention on this in our country, and I think it's growing kind of globally. So people are interested in how we resolve those issues going forward. And then to that end, on this next slide, I thought it would be really good to start with what's worked to date. And I've been kind of gathering up these examples over the past couple of years as I've thought about this problem. So in the first one that I want to highlight is the U.S. warning system. And in this case, what I'm talking about is issuing of severe weather warnings, whether they're for hurricanes or tornadoes or flash floods. And in the U.S., it's recognized that the National Weather Service is the sole warning authority. And that's really not only respected, but respected and supported by broadcasters and digital providers. They take the National Weather Service warning, they deliver it in a timely manner, it's unaltered, and it has attribution with it. And that wasn't always the case. In the 80s and the early 90s, we saw a number of broadcasters at that time issuing their own tornado warnings and all. And really how we've evolved to this point, I think, is twofold. One is a recognition of public safety. Our social science really tells us that if people hear conflicting information, they often then won't move, won't take appropriate action. And then there's no doubt some liability concerns. But the challenges here I see are kind of twofold. One is the warning formats really lag industry standards, and I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide in a moment. But the other point that I want to make is that the business interest needs really surpass the government services. So businesses have thresholds for action that are really different from the National Weather Service warning thresholds. So we are starting to see a business-to-business relationship grow up between providers, weather providers, and companies. So they're not designed for the public overall, but it's kind of recognizing that what the government is delivering isn't sufficient for businesses. So in this next slide, I wanted to just tease out this issue about how warning services in the U.S. haven't evolved. And I want to be kind of clear about language here. They've evolved tremendously in terms of accuracy and timeliness of warnings. But the delivery of the information and how easily it is consumed has not evolved in the way that we need it to evolve. So this is just an example of a flash flood warning. And I could show you any number of these things. They're done by naming counties and things like that. And I really think we need to be much more creative, and something that the private sector, in partnership with the public sector, could do really well. And I think that we're really lagging behind in that in the U.S. So it's an area, it's an opportunity for collaboration there if we can find the right win-win in that. The next example that I have is on collaborative forecasting. And this is, I think, a really interesting one. This is more than a decade old. And this particular product was actually driven by airline needs. So this product is really pre-shadows what the convective alerts are going to look like, and notices to airmen. And in this case, there's an online chat room that's open for 30 minutes for collaboration. And I know that when I worked for the weather company IBM, our aviation forecasters participated in this on a daily basis. And what they were bringing into the discussion was not only their meteorological expertise and interpretations, but really a good understanding of what some of the thresholds were for the airlines, so that there could be a proper analysis of the risk and the benefits for where those products are joined. So my assessment of this collaborative forecasting is that it's limited in scope, but it's successful, and it's really, it's really creative. We have that interaction going on between the public and the private sector a couple times a day, every day. And the next example that I have is on community modeling. So we have and have had a long time in the U.S., more than 20 years, an open source community model. And the private sector has had access to that model. But there has been, I think, an interesting partnership that developed between IBM and NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research, on this model. So IBM took the MPAS model and has applied that globally and ported it to GPU-based machines. And in the process of doing that, as part of this collaboration, they have given back into the open source code all of the code that's required to do that. So they didn't keep that for competitive edge. So with respect to community modeling, sharing's encouraged, but it's not required. I think, one of the incentives for sharing includes professional development for staff, being able to really talk publicly about what you've done and your contributions. I think there's more ways that we could incentivize community modeling, and I'll make another point further down of something that NOAA is taking on right now that feeds very nicely into it. By the way, the graphics at the top here are over India, and it's kind of pre and post modeling. So you see that great 4-kilometer resolution on the end, and that's powered by some unique IBM data that's there. On the next example that I have is the U.S. Federal Appropriations and legislative process. So I think that this is largely a success, although it's far from perfect. But the idea here is that the private sector is engaged in our federal appropriations process, and it doesn't happen too often, but when there's actually a law passed. So the private sector has been a strong supporter of NOAA satellites and funding for federal research for a long time. And that makes a difference to our appropriators on the Hill. They'll respond to it when a private business says to them that it really is helping grow the economy and businesses for there. We also had the second bullet here talks about a law that was passed, I think it was late 2017, it might be early 2018, and there was really active engagement by really all parties, the federal sector, the academic sector, and the private sector, on what the priorities were for this Forecast Improvement Act. And I think it got a lot better because of that. It's far from perfect, as I've never seen a piece of legislation that I thought was perfect. But it's actually, I think, been better because of all the involvement there. And I think Louis Uccellini would agree with that assertion. And the bottom line bullet here does talk about a new modeling approach known as EPIC, environmental prediction, and the C is a center, although it's going to be a virtual center. And this is something that NOAA has taken on, and there's money, currently, tentatively in the appropriation process. Nothing has been decided yet. But it's the idea of setting up a center where there could be more collaboration between the public and the private sector for this modeling code. And this is getting, and will get, I think, more and more support from the private sector on the Hill to move this forward. And I think that will overall help U.S. modeling efforts. So those are the examples I have. And this next slide, I just kind of want to give you an assessment of where we are, because it's, it's not all rosy. And this is a kind of, if you think about moving from conflict all the way over to collaboration, I would say in the 1990s, we were in a conflict stage. The private sector was taking positions like the National Weather Service should not be on the internet. And as I alluded to before, there were multiple people issuing warnings. And I think now we're in kind of the coordination stage. We got there through a lot of ongoing communication. That was really enabled by, in large part, by the work that the American Meteorological Society did. They restructured their volunteer organization to be focused on this problem. And at the same time, NOAA passed some policies on how they would develop new services that really allowed the private sector to put input into those. So at the end of the day, it's not that everything is perfect, but I think it's better. We are not, however, at the point of what I would call collaboration. So there is more for sure that could be done as we move forward. So let me get to the elephants in the room. That's a recent picture from a trip I was fortunate enough to go to in Tanzania, and I loved, as they call them, the Ellies over there. So the issues, top issue is really public good, because I think that's why many people in this room are involved in this. It's certainly why I became involved in this, this field of study. And it's more important now, I think, than ever with climate change. So it should be kind of something that we all ask ourselves. But nipping at its heels, if not right beside it, is the economics of the situation. And that works, both in the public sector and the private sector. You can't stay in business in the private sector unless you're, unless you're turning a profit. You're answerable, if you're a publicly traded company, to shareholders. So there's complexities on that. And then the third bullet here is about national interests. And, I recognize, I think, that one size doesn't fit all in terms of what this enterprise is going to look like. It looks very different in the US, and I think it will evolve other places. So those national interests come into play here. And then I do want to point out that there's really evolving business trends. Businesses are moving away from selling things to selling services, including infrastructure as a service and others. And I think some of my fellow panelists will talk a little bit more maybe about that. I do, in terms of, what are the tools in our toolbox to help move us forward, I do think these community forums for discussion are good. You have to kind of meet people to, develop a level of trust. But the other thing I think is we have to be willing to take some chances with some targeted collaborative experiments. And I think we should take them on in a way that we kind of, what we would call in industry, fail fast. It's either working for you or you move on and do something else. So on the next slide, that kind of reminds us, NOAA took on this big data project, which was designed to open up its data holdings onto the internet, brought a lot of private sector players into that, really expanded the field. and gave a broad umbrella for discussions and other efforts. So it's starting to, I think there's goodness in this. It hasn't solved all our problems, but it's an example of being creative. And they did this, by the way, through a competitive process. So they were able to do multiple, as they were, no-cost awards, but it was a kind of a level playing field type of thing. And then I want to just talk about data policy because it's something I spent a lot of time thinking about. And I think a couple of points. One is commercial data is here and now. The other is that, recognizing that through WMO Resolution 40, open access is an established practice. So I don't see us really going away from that. But I see us really having to develop national policies that are really adaptable to what's going to be evolving amounts of commercial data and evolving science and technology. So one of the things that I've thought about is, do we need to kind of set a floor for what's open and shareable and adjust the floor as time goes along? So for example, all of the GPS RO data that the US is party to is open. And I don't think we should go back from kind of that resolution of data and amount of data that's shared. But, if need be, and I should say I'm no fan of this, but if the federal government finds that it has to do something commercially and doesn't have license to freely distribute it, I think it needs to have a floor for what is freely distributed. And then I'm going to end on a really happy note, my last slide, that we are celebrating our 100th anniversary at AMS. So if you haven't made your plans and you can, I hope you'll consider joining us in Boston. We have a great centennial meeting lined up. It's already got one of the largest, it does have the largest registration ever, and lots of great sessions. And we're going to have a great party there as well. So I hope you can come. Thank you. Good afternoon. I regret not being there in person.
Oh. Just in case you missed it.
This conversation this afternoon.
We finished with it.
So I want to address a few things.
Thank you. An invitation to Boston as well, to a party. That can't be bad. Clicking through those slides took me back to an occasion. Well, we had a bit of a period when there were problems with the clickers at the BBC Weather Centre that we used to move through the graphics. And we ended up on more than one occasion having to click through other people's slides during a live broadcast, which is pretty stressful for both participants, as you can imagine. Okay, some interesting stuff there, which again we can discuss later on. Although obviously Mary won't be able to answer any questions on her talk. There's tea and coffee waiting outside in the library, just across the way. We're doing pretty well for time. If I could ask you to start wending your way back into the lecture theatre at 2:30, please, and then we can kick off with the session for the next two speakers. Thank you very much.